Lovely. So, hi, everybody. I'll admit that I'm really not used to doing talks, so I'm going to stumble over my words a lot, and I have a nasty habit of talking too fast. If I am kind of rushing through or rambling too much, just drop in the chat and tell me to shut up, and I'll move on to the next point. That's totally okay, or at the very least, somebody will let me know verbally. But I wanted to do a talk based on things that I wish I'd been taught when I was starting up my own indie studio, which I started about 2 years ago now with a group of friends. We are 15 members strong, and it's been a rough journey, a very fulfilling journey, mind, but a very rough one because there's just so many things that you feel like should be public knowledge but aren't really mentioned to you until after the fact. So I figured it'd be helpful to go through some of those in case anybody was planning on starting their studio, and it might help save a little bit of the headache that I then had to interact with. So without further ado, just as a heads up, this is going to be a very short presentation. I don't see the point in giving a bunch of advice that comes across as one size fits all for every studio, and it would just be a lot of me talking about things that I've experienced, which is all well and good, but it might not be relevant to your situation. So the way I was planning to do this, so this is stage depending, is to have my little presentation and then have a little Q&A section where you can bring up any concerns you have, any general questions, going back on any points I might have said. And also that I, despite being the director of an indie studio, am in no way a high professional here. Like, I've been running my own studio, but we run it very differently to how I imagine it is in the like AAA world, for example, or even in like professional indie world. So don't take my word as gospel. Everything is relevant to your studio and your situation. And you have to adapt what I say to that situation. So don't come to me 5 years later and say, like, you told me this and it was wrong. I might be wrong. I'm actually very likely to be wrong. And that's the joy of it. Like I said, I own the Vampires Manor Studios. We are an indie studio based in Norwich, UK. We're a team of 15 members who are completely volunteer. Not a single one of us gets paid as much as we'd like to be. And all of us work across multiple different disciplines. We're very dev heavy at the minute. We've got about 5 devs. We're a very mixed bag team of people from different parts of the UK, some from not even in the UK at all. And we are currently working on our debut title, which is pronounced Fox. I get that problem a lot. Which is a puzzle platformer survival horror. Think Stray meets Okami meets Resident Evil. We've been working on Fox for about 2 years. We did the Transfuser program last year, which is what really kicked it off. And we're in that awkward intermediate stage between the concept of the game in the studio and getting funding. Like I said, we're all working for free. Once we do acquire funding, whether it be from an investor or a publisher, we will be working full-time on the game. But as of right now, this is sort of our part-time passion project while we work at our day jobs. And understandably, like everywhere else in the games industry right now, it's rough trying to figure out how to make a game whilst working at a day job. I work at a betting shop, so it's tricky, but we've been pulling it off. We're currently working on our demo. We're hoping to get that released some point soon, and then it will be a lot easier for us to get funding. So in terms of the timeline, amazing graph, I know. It all stemmed from my second year of uni when I didn't get an internship that I said I was going to get because we decided to join uni when COVID happened, and I was really salty about it, so I took a year off of uni. And I remember sitting in my student house, looking up at my ceiling, and thinking, in this very household, I've got myself as a concept artist, I've got another concept artist that's downstairs, the room next to me has a developer and a 3D artist, and downstairs is another developer. I could just make a studio. And then I went and banged on all their doors and dragged them into the kitchen, said, we're going to make a game. Which then blew up into what is now TVM. We conceptualized the idea of Fox as a group by just throwing ideas of what we wanted to work on at a wall and seeing what sticks. And I'll go a bit more on that later. Got into the Transfuser program in April, managed to graduate the Transfuser program with flying colours, unfortunately did not get the funding from UK Games Fund, and then we legally became an actual studio in January this year. I'm happy to report that we are worth £1. So it's all up and up here at TVM. And like I said, now we're currently working on our first demo. We are fully in the development stage. It's just trying to get the time on top of normal things. And there's been a lot of challenges so far. So I have never led a team before. The closest I've been is a supervisor at Smiggle. And as a result, trying to formulate a team and then figure out exactly where I need to be at what time has been really tricky. A lot of my team are disadvantaged or discriminated against. I want to say that about 80% of us are neurodivergent, most of us are LGBT, a couple of us are POC or otherwise, and a good chunk of us are also disabled. So trying to work out ways to accommodate all of these things whilst also keeping us running is tricky, very worthwhile, but very tricky. As you've all seen, the industry is kind of falling apart at the minute. We've got layoffs left and right. As a result, funding is harder and harder to get. I had basically no guidance coming out of uni with this company. I've had to figure out everything more or less myself, at least to begin with. I did get some help later, and again, I'll touch on that later. As I mentioned, all of us work part-time on top of the cost of living crisis, so we've had to work more and more hours off-game in order to carry on funding the game. We do have an issue with overscoping, which I'm pretty sure every indie at some point has had an issue with overscoping. And the big one is that we just are struggling to get funding. It's a very tough competition, especially for indies at the minute, because all of them are so beautiful and so talented, and it's really hard to compete with that. But there is definitely enough to go around. It's just finding the right publisher and or investor for you and for your team. So, I wanted to go over the three main chunks of game development, the problems I faced with each, and what I wish somebody had told me during those stages. So in terms of the conception stage, this is really early on. You don't even necessarily have a team yet. You don't have a game yet. You're just trying to figure out more or less what you want to do. And the biggest one, it's really hard to get people to join your team if you're not paying them. And it's even harder once they're even in the team to maintain that motivation throughout the project if there's no immediate reward for it, which is totally understandable. You know, it's really hard to do any job if it's not rewarding you in some way, shape, or form. And the easiest way I found to deal with that is when you're concepting the game is to have at least a topic in there that everyone likes. So when we made Fox, I just had a Discord channel and I said, throw in some things that you would like to work on. I'm a furry artist in my part-time, so I said I would be more comfortable working on a game with an animal protagonist because it means I don't have to learn how to draw people. And then our narrative designer, Joe, came in and said, well, actually, I've been writing a thesis on Arctic expeditions, so I would love it to be in the Arctic. And it just kind of kept going like that. So the entire game has a little chunk of something that everyone wants to work on, and that really goes a long way when it comes to trying to keep your team motivated and keep them going, because then it turns into essentially mini portfolio projects where people can work on their specific task and still feel fulfilled by it and still feel proud of it and want to do it really well because it's something that they wanted to do anyway, except now it's part of something much bigger. It's kind of killing two birds with one stone. In terms of your company's goals, your time, your like quote unquote level of effort, I don't like using that phrase, but it's the best I could think of. Because the thing that I've seen other teams have issue with is that they've started a studio going, oh yeah, this will be fine, it's just making a game together, right? Not realizing that you've got the whole business side of things to worry about, whether it be from publishing or social media or anything along those lines, the legal parts of it, which still hurt my head to this day. A lot of people think that that's just an add-on they can deal with later and not integral to the development of the game. So a big one you need to figure out if you're starting an indie studio is, do you just want this to be a project that you would release? Or do you want to be a company? Do you want to be a studio? Because if you want to be a studio, you need to take on multiple projects. You need to think about the direction of your company. Do you want to be bought out by a publisher? Do you want to remain your own company for the future? You really have to think about these things early on. Otherwise, it's going to save you so much headache later. Like, we had to have a whole discussion about how I never planned for TVM to get this big, and I never planned to try and even make a funded game. Originally it started as a project just between friends, and did I want to continue it down that line? I've gone with yes, but it was a lot of overwhelm all at once about having to work out HMRC and Companies House and legal fees and everything else. So I'd recommend getting that out the way first if you can. It seems like a really pointless decision to have early on. It's really not. In terms of how to even make a studio, just there's no shame in asking people. I had a weird thing where I didn't want to ask for help. I wanted to research everything myself. Don't do that. It's stupid. There's no point. I ended up going back and asking the careers team at anyway, and they helped me with setting everything up. Our environment artist, Jack, his dad owns his own company. It's not games related, but even asking him, like, hey, what do these words mean? What's a VAT code? What's stuff like this? There is no shame in just asking everybody you know, whether you think it's relevant or not. And in terms of overscoping, single-handedly what saved us is having a game Bible. Write down exactly what mechanics you need to have your base game and stick to it. It's all very well and good being like, oh, but you could add this mechanic here, and oh, they could add that there, and it's great, and that's how you make some very cool ideas, but that's also how you get burnt out really quickly, and then you get an ever-growing list of things that just never get completed, whereas if you have a hard, fast game Bible that you do not deviate from until you finish the Bible, you're more likely to actually get your project done and released, and then you can add stuff afterwards. In terms of the development stage, which I would argue is the hardest stage of the three, it's things like maintaining your morale, your motivation. Like I said earlier, it's really hard to do so if you're not getting paid, but little things like assigning people to tasks that they're going to enjoy, taking breaks, quote unquote research and development days, which is definitely just an excuse to play new games under the name of research. I went on Steam on sale once and bought like 5 games and was like, yeah, no, it's definitely research. It's integral to the game, actually. Just hanging out, if it's people that you are lucky enough to live nearby, just go out for coffee. It seems really stupid, but just taking a break and talking about things, you don't even have to talk about the game, really does wonders. And it's getting harder and harder to keep motivation with everything going on in the world, but you have to figure out what works out for you. And it gets 10 times harder if a lot of your team are also neurodivergent. I'm autistic. I burn out very, very quickly. But little things like I have Tuesday evenings and Thursday evenings, I don't talk about the game. I don't look at the game. I don't think about the game. I'm usually playing Dungeons and Dragons. And that's helped a lot. By the time I get off, I'm like, oh, actually, I have got an idea, and then I can log on. And it just helps to have those specific breaks that have been rotated in almost. Make sure you do that. Don't only break when you feel like you're exhausted, because you're just never going to come off that break. There are times you're going to have to adjust the scope mid-development. It's just how it goes. You get about halfway through and you're like, am I allowed to swear before I carry on that sentence? I'm going to go with no for now. And you think, oh my god, we're not going to make the deadline. We're really struggling. What do we do? As stupid and simple as it is, just adjust it. Like, it is so much better to adjust the scope while you're doing it than try and rush yourself and go through crunch to finish a single task, which is then going to burn you out, and the task might not get done as efficiently or as perfectly as you need it to, so you're going to have to go back later, and you're going to have to fix it anyway. Just adjust the scope. See if there's anything you can cut out. See if you can move members from one task to another to help finish that main task. Just usually, if an answer is simple, it's also correct, as much as a lot of people do not like to think of it that way. I've noticed that devs in particular really don't like taking the simple route. I don't know what it is with y'all. I don't get it, but sometimes just take the easy way out. There will be times as well where you're either losing or gaining some team members, whether you just had a fallout or whether they had bigger and better things to move on to. I've lost a couple members just because they've got real jobs in the industry, which is really upsetting for me. How dare they leave my silly little project to go work at things like giant animation? It's just rude. So what I recommend doing early on in development is making a quote-unquote ideal team builder, one of each department that you need to keep the game running. So in our case, we've got at least one concept artist, one animator, one narrative designer, and one dev, just to get the game working. It won't be pretty, and you can try and hire more people on later, but it will at least get a demo, which means you can get funding, which means you can then hire the other people that you need. And with members having to work part-time, like I said, this has been a huge issue for us. It's just working out a plan that works for everyone before you start. So the current issue at hand, I'm lucky that I can bring my tablet to work and I can carry on directing from there. But, for example, our lead programmer, Chris, works at a cinema. He can't really bring his whole setup, as hilarious as it would be, and serve popcorn at the same time. So it's a matter of, he had a talk with his manager and said, look, I'm going to need XYZ day off, because I have a side project that is essentially my second job. This is non-negotiable, can I please have these off? And then we know those are the days he's working. Of course, that doesn't work for everybody. Not every job's that forgiving. But it is unique to your situation, but trying to work out at least 1 or 2 days a week where you can be off, or even if not that, if, say, you're a teacher and half term's coming up and you don't have to mark anything, just blitz through a bunch of tasks then, and then crack back on. And then, final one, I told you this was going to be short, the pitching stage, which is what I'm currently going through. The biggest one that has been getting me, and this has caused me so much overwhelm and so much headache, is that conflicting advice, right? I think I've spoken to about 20 or 30 people now about our pitch deck, and at least every single one has a different idea of what it needs to be, and half the time these two things can't be the same. So one person told me, okay, your pitch deck needs to be no more than 8 pages, but the other one said, no, it's okay, it can be as long as you need it to. It's not like you're presenting it anyway. And then the third said, no, but you will be presenting it, so you need to put as little text on as possible. And the fourth said, but you need more text because otherwise then it's going to be misconstrued. And it just goes back and forth, and it's really confusing, and it's really stressful. So the easiest way that I've had to think about it is go with the person that is going with your style of game more. We're doing a horror game. I've taken the advice of a publisher who's working on horror games. Just the most relevant to your situation that you can, and go with that. And at the end of the day, you just have to lock in that answer. And it's probably, it might be wrong. You might then go to another publisher and they say, well, this is stupid, you should have followed my advice. And then you try again. You just make another pitch deck, keep a sort of list of assets that you can quickly switch in and out, pages that you can take in and out. And if you have to use a different pitch deck for each one, you have to use a different pitch deck for each one. It is stressful and it is tiring, but it's the only way to really work with all of this information that doesn't necessarily work together. And on that note, when I first started, it was that investors and publishers are terrifying. You know, you kind of imagine these sort of big bosses in their spin around chairs with a cat in their lap, like a James Bond villain, but they're really not all that. I was lucky enough to meet Damien Palvak from Feardemic, and he, upon meeting me, was like, "Oh, so have you played one of our games?" And I said, "Oh yeah, I've played Dark, which I really recommend, by the way." And he says, "Oh well, what did you play it on?" I said, "PC," and he just goes into his bag and hands me a copy on the Switch and goes, "There you go. Anyway, what did you want to talk about?" And I was so flustered from just being given a free game that I forgot I was talking to a publisher. A lot of them are really nice. That a lot of people in the games industry in general are really nice. I probably don't need to tell half of you that. But just because they're in a quote-unquote higher-up position does not mean that they're not normal people. And chances are they have the same interests as you. And if you get silly and excited about your game, they will get silly and excited about your game. Not everything has to be so serious. And if you're asking for a lot of money, that can feel quite scary. If you come from a poorer background like myself, the idea of even asking for tens of thousands is terrifying, because to you that's like, oh my god, that could set me up for life. To publishers, as the guy from NeoWiz, who published Lies of P, told me, to 200k and 500k is negligible. The difference is irrelevant. If they like your game enough, they will give you millions if they have to. It's just about selling your company or your product to them in a way that makes them really want to see it come to life. You can ask for as much as you want. And I'd recommend, if you're working out on a budget, asking for a little bit extra. So this leads into the next one. Always add a money cushion. So we worked out that our team, all 15 members, if we wanted to get paid £13 an hour for about a year, would come to, I think it was 410,000. Don't quote me on that, I'm not good at numbers. To which the NeoWiz guy said, okay, ask for 500k. Just put a really good cushion in the way, because sometimes things happen. Unreal Engine is very cruel and will just decide one day that it wants to delete your project out of nowhere, and you have to start again, and I'm definitely not still upset about that. And things just happen. Deadlines will not be met. It's easier to then ask in advance, okay, we're going to need an extra 50k, than to have to crawl back to your publisher with your tail between your legs and say halfway through development that you're not going to make that deadline, and we ask for a little more money, a little more time. Just add it in advance. It's much easier. I don't know how the phrase goes. It's easier to ask for permission than for forgiveness. So I would really recommend just adding a buffer to your budget and to your time and to your everything, to be honest. Even however long you think development's going to take, it's going to take at least 3 months longer, minimum. That is it. Like I say, I don't want to sit here and give you loads and loads of advice about every single aspect of the industry, because at the end of the day, I don't know everything, and I'm not going to pretend to know everything. But the main takeaway is to adjust any advice you get from any source to your company and work out what works for you. It doesn't matter if other people are like, oh, well, that's not correct because when we did it, because at the end of the day, they are not you. And It's working to your strengths and your uniqueness that's what really gives your company the edge over others, especially when it comes to funding and when it comes to development. So you really need to keep that in mind. I have an obligatory embarrassing photos of my team just to promise that I am actually a developer and I do kind of know what I talk about. And that's pretty much it. Do we have any questions? Sorry that I talk so fast.
There was one question. So if you're a group and you aren't registered as a company but you're still developing, what kind of legal issues would you face in making that happen?
So
If you don't mind me asking.
no, you're all good. You wouldn't necessarily have many legal issues, as far as I'm aware, if you're not registered as a company's house. The only one that could possibly be a problem in the future is things like IP and copyright. Obviously, if you're releasing your game early or even releasing a demo or images or anything and you want to keep it copyrighted, that would then come under its own entire thing. But other than that, you wouldn't have to worry about any admin fees. You wouldn't have to worry about I forget what it's called. Ours is coming up soon, but I can't remember what it's called in English. We have to like send off documents every year to prove that you're still not trading, because we've got that coming up soon. So you should be okay. I honestly would recommend holding off on registering at Company's House for as long as you can. We only did it because we had to for Transfuser. Speaking of, if you are a recent graduate, I really would recommend Transfuser. So you should be okay as far as I know. Unfortunately, I'm not a legal expert and it still confuses me to this day. But I'd say, yeah, just keep an eye on your IP management, and other than that, you should be fine.
So another one.
Mm-hmm.
What's the best way to keep everyone hyped up and involved in the project? Because obviously, if there's not too much money involved, that can be an issue with motivation.
Yes.
So what's the best way to get everyone excited and involved?
It sounds really stupid, but carrying on the work does do that. Like can you see my mouse actually? This guy up here is Toby, and he's essentially our ace in the hole. He's our composer. And the first time that he sent us a little track of a piece of music he'd made for the game, all of us lost our minds. We went insane, and there was a 3 week or so just burst where we wanted to get stuff done because we wanted to see that track in the game. And then every so often I'll post a bit of concept art and everyone's like, oh, I can take that, and everyone will run off and do their own things. It sounds really stupid, but working is what makes the motivation. It's the seeing things kind of piece together bit by bit. Even just if you're like me and you really like lists, making a list and watching things get ticked off. And if all else fails, just take a break. Go and play some games. Just keep an eye on the games industry. Go watch things like Gamescom or other release shows and think, wouldn't it be so cool if my game was up there? And then that tends to, at least that works for me. Like I say, it's different for every person, but that's what I do to make myself feel a little bit more motivated to work on the game.
Yeah, that's awesome. We have another question. How would you go about finding a publisher or funding that suits your company and the game you're making? Is it a chuck it at the wall and see what sticks kind of situation?
It can be. What I would personally say is break your game down into its most raw genres and then try and find specific publishers that work with that. So we're looking at things like Feardemic, we're looking at Dread XP, we're looking at Mob Entertainment, we're looking at Devolver, places that kind of work specifically with really stylized horror indie games. Because they are more likely to accept us. Technically, you can apply anywhere. When we went to develop Brighton, I would talk and pitch the game to literally anybody who asked. But it's better to try and find one that will work specifically in that kind of genre. Because, for example, we applied for Fireshine, and we did not get Fireshine because they said that while the game was cool, they're just not interested in platformers, which is fine. You know, you won't fit every publisher's idea of their brand because it's about their brand as much as yours. So try and match it up as well as you can before you apply.